2 videos in 1 week. That hasn't happened in a while. But I wanted to talk today about another interesting part of history, American history, sports history, something that I've recently found interesting, so I thought you might find interesting as well, and that is around the person of Cassius Clay, aka Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali is the former heavyweight champion of the world, who many believe to be the greatest fighter of all time. I am not a fan of Ali's, and I'm going to tell you why. And it's based off of a lot of interesting information about him that probably much of it was known at the time of his life when he was actively involved in sports and the media. Much of it has been forgotten with time, as tend to happen with icons. You know, certain things get exaggerated and lionized, and other things kind of get forgotten and sort of shoved under the closet door. But there's also some things that probably a lot of people who haven't ever really delved deep into Ali and his life even know about him. He's a very enigmatic figure, and he rose to popularity for a variety of reasons, beyond just his boxing prowess. I've already said I'm not a fan of Ali's, but just to give credit where credit is due, I would say that I think that Ali is probably the heavyweight fighter who had the greatest overall career during the greatest era of heavyweight boxing. Okay, so that's a very specific series of qualifications there. I don't think he's the greatest fighter of all time, pound for pound. That would be Sugar Ray Robinson. I don't think he had the greatest or most dominant career of any boxer. I think that would be Joe Louis or Jack Johnson. I don't even think he was the best fighter in his prime. I think that the best prime fighter, like when he was in his prime, was probably Mike Tyson. Unfortunately for Tyson, that was for a very short period of time. I should say heavyweight fighter in the prime. I think actually Joe Frazier in his prime was probably better than Ali. And certainly in their first fight together, Frazier wins that fight. So we do have history to support that. But regardless of all that, Ali has this phenomenal career that lasts for a very, very long time. And, you know, has these ups and downs. He has this period of time where he's not even allowed to fight because of his controversial political stance around the Vietnam War, which is an important piece of history as well that we'll have to talk about. But he also loses, right? He loses to Frazier, he loses to Ken Norton later, but then he comes back. He becomes the first fighter to ever win the heavyweight title 3 times in his career. So he does have that to his credit. But one of the reasons why people oftentimes celebrate Ali is because of his sort of social political stance in a very controversial era of the 1960s, when the country is in the middle of a war, the war in Vietnam, but they're also going through a lot of social revolution in the form of civil rights, okay? And what Ali did that got him sort of to become, let's say, more relevant within certain circles and certain communities was initially his stance on the Vietnam War, right? The Vietnam War was a controversial war, and initially it was one of these wars that was kind of divided in terms of opinion. There were people who were very pro-war, there were young people especially were very anti-war. Ali comes out early on and takes a anti-war stance against Vietnam, and then he gets chastised for it by being essentially banned from boxing. He has his boxing license removed. Starts from the state of New York and then a series of other states, and then eventually he has to go to trial for basically draft evasion, and there's the potential that he's going to have to serve 6 years in prison. He obviously appeals. Eventually he wins his case and is able to return to boxing, but not without being unable to box for several years, okay? And what happens over that period of time is the war starts to become less popular, and then Ali becomes like a messianic figure, right? Because he's this guy who sort of sacrificed his career in order to make this political stance around the war. Sorry, my phone got out of focus there for a minute. And so most people know that, okay? They know that about him, and that's kind of why they celebrate him, because he kind of ends up being on the right side of history. But we should start there first, because the reality is that a lot of people may not know is that Ali wasn't actually anti-war. Ali claims that the reason he doesn't support the Vietnam War, when finally pressed on the issue, right, not other than him just saying, "Oh, I don't have a problem with the Viet Cong, they never did anything to me," is that the Nation of Islam or the black Muslims don't support the war because it's not a war on Islam, okay? And therefore, because it doesn't have the support of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, Muhammad Ali does not support the war. However, if Elijah Muhammad or the Nation of Islam was to support the Vietnam War or any other war, Ali says he would participate. So it's not necessarily an anti-war stance. It's not even really a political stance in the sense of Vietnam versus some other place. It's really just linked specifically to the religious ideology of the Nation of Islam. Okay, so that's sort of caveat number one, which a lot of people may not understand. Okay. But more importantly, what's ironic about Ali is he's celebrated as this sort of civil rights figure, right? Because this is, again, the era of the civil rights. And to his credit, Ali's very pro-black. And what I mean by that is he's part of the Black is Beautiful movement. He's really adamant about and outspoken about dating and marrying black women, versus a lot of his contemporaries who would date out of their race and marry and or be involved romantically or sexually with white women. And so that's kind of a new thing that's sort of emerging in sort of leftist cultures, right? So Ali ends up kind of becoming a spokesperson and going around when he can't fight and giving these tours at these top tier universities, Stanford and Berkeley and stuff like this, where there's sort of this social revolution going on. So again, it seems great on the surface, but what a lot of people don't really realize about Ali is that he was not only enigmatic, but he was extremely hypocritical and often extremely inconsistent in his own values and beliefs. So first and foremost, what a lot of people don't understand is that the Nation of Islam was actually a pro-segregationist group. Okay, so what's happening in the world at that time is people are trying to eradicate the segregation laws, right? They're trying to get rid of the old Jim Crow policies that don't allow whites and blacks to commingle, right, in society. But then there's extremist groups. You obviously have your white supremacists who are trying to maintain segregation. They don't want the whites and blacks mixing. But there's also extremist groups on the other end of the spectrum who also are pro-segregationists. They don't want the intermingling of white and blacks. And as it turns out, the Nation of Islam and Muhammad Ali were actually pro-segregationist. So when people are looking at Ali as a civil rights figure, they're not realizing that he was actually arguing for the same position as white supremacy, which is that whites and blacks should not intermingle. Okay, so that's one important caveat. Okay, that should be mentioned. A lot of people look to Ali's relationship with Malcolm X and try to sort of amalgamate or equivocate, is probably the better term, those two people's positions, but that's not actually true. In fact, quite the opposite. Ali is friends with Malcolm X early on in Malcolm X's sort of political fame, okay? That's because early on, Malcolm X is still tied to the Nation of Islam. In fact, Malcolm X is sought out by Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the black Muslims, to sort of pursue Ali and bring him in because he thinks it'll help to bring popularity and attention to the movement. And Malcolm X does that. But what happens is, as probably most people know, Malcolm X ends up leaving the Nation of Islam. And many people know there was a falling out between him and Elijah Muhammad, but they may not know what the reason for that was. The Nation of Islam was being heavily investigated by FBI, CIA, and a variety of different organizations, not only because they were considered an extremist group and there was fear of retaliation or violence, but what they actually found was that Elijah Muhammad was a pedophile, and that he was bringing in a lot of young women, hiring them as his secretaries, and then using his sort of power as essentially a cult leader to persuade these young underage women to have sex with him, claiming that he needed to basically, have his seed live on, and so he needs to procreate as much as possible. And then these young girls would adhere to his teachings. They would often get pregnant by him, have his children, but then be removed from the Nation of Islam because they had broken one of its vital, important laws, which is they can't have sexual relationships or bear children outside of wedlock. So really, he was just using these women. And again, like I said, they were all underage, and it ended up being many girls, not just, like one. As Malcolm X found that out, he actually withdrew his support of the Nation of Islam, and that's actually why he left. And what a lot of people overlook is that Ali did not go with Malcolm. He sided with Elijah Muhammad. And what's interesting about that brings us into another really important thing that you should probably know about Muhammad Ali that a lot of people don't talk about or don't know. And that is the Nation of Islam, besides being pro-segregationist, was also extremely misogynistic and had very, very repressive opinions about the relationship between men and women. In fact, it ends up being the reason why Ali's first wife leaves him and basically abandons their marriage. And to be fair, Ali actually does outline this in his autobiography, although he doesn't go into great detail about it. But the wife actually communicates why she left. But what is actually probably more problematic is that what Ali does after that is he sides up with Elijah Muhammad, and basically from there on, Elijah Muhammad sort of supplies Ali with a string of young women over the next several decades who end up becoming his wives. I use that in scare quotes. He does have one official wife who, by the way, when he meets her and is introduced to her by Elijah Muhammad, she's 17 years old, and she's just graduated from Elijah Muhammad's school of whatever, where they basically bring these young women in and train them how to be proper women of the Nation of Islam. And it's basically about being subservient to your man, and basically it's almost like more of a servant role in this culture. And I think when Ali marries her, she's either 17 or 18. And she basically becomes more like a servant to him. In the Nation of Islam, you're allowed to have up to 4 wives. And Ali, while he doesn't legally have 4, usually had at least 4 official wives that he traveled with. And then he also was known to be, a frequent abuser of prostitutes and escorts and things. In fact, it gets to the point that his second wife, who marries him very young, reports in a really great biography written by a man by the name of Jonathan Eig, E-I-G, who writes this biography, and it comes out in 2017, by the way, which is the year after Ali dies. And the thing I like about this biography is Eig doesn't he doesn't worry about being discreet in a lot of this information. He doesn't pull any punches, let's say, for a boxing metaphor. And he goes into a lot of the deeper, darker sides of Ali's life and even talks to a lot of these people. And what this first wife tells us in this story is that actually Ali would actually use her to coordinate his philandering. She would actually be responsible for contacting his prostitutes and his women. She would often reserve rooms for him. In fact, he even was caught oftentimes on vacation with his family and children, with these, prostitutes and things, and she just would cover it up for her. That was basically her job, more or less. He was totally uninvolved with his children, child rearing. Sports Illustrated author who's doing an article on him does there's a famous picture of Ali changing a baby's diaper, which was completely staged, but Ali then later admits he's never changed a diaper in his life. He also admits he's never read a book. And actually didn't really know that much about the Nation of Islam. So it's sort of just one of these weird things where we think about that. In fact, many of the things he said in his speeches when he would go to tour on the university was actually stuff he completely pulled and sort of stole from Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad didn't care because it was Muhammad Ali and he was getting him fame, but it wasn't stuff that Ali himself even came up with or generated. But even more problematic of that is it seems that what comes out in this book by Eig is that Ali himself was a pedophile. And that many of these women that he was involved with and officially either officially married, at a very young age, 17, 18 years old, or unofficially married and became part of his sort of whatever, harem, he oftentimes was involved with them sexually before that. In fact, one of his wives reports that their sexual relationship began when she was 12 years old. Okay, so if you take that back now and look at what we know about Elijah Muhammad and the fact that Ali continues to support Muhammad and, what we know about that, it sort of fits there. So it does appear that he was not only a misogynist and a polygamist, but also a pedophile. Now, when you coordinate that with the fact that in the civil rights movement, it's not just about civil rights for people of color, it's also about civil rights for women, right? This is the era where we're moving into the feminist era of culture. It's extremely ironic and hypocritical that the very people who are celebrating Ali because of his stance on Vietnam and his perceived perception within black culture don't recognizing that he's completely suppressive of women and is doing all these extremely problematic things in his own life when it comes to his relationship with the opposite sex. So all of this stuff kind of gets overlooked and forgotten about Ali. Obviously, over time, he does become a little bit softer on even his political stance. He ends up working directly with the federal government later in the Gulf Wars, and actually goes over to, like, I think it's actually Saudi Arabia, to get Saddam Hussein to release some of our captive soldiers because of his connection to the Muslim world, which, credit to him that he got the soldiers. But again, it shows that Ali had no problem with war. It wasn't that he was anti-war. It just was whether it was related to Islam or not. And that was sort of his thing. That was really his driving factor. But yeah, I mean, he was inconsistent on his stance on war. That was not really accurate. Even his position on race is not what people think. It wasn't it wasn't an integrated perspective. It was a pro-segregation perspective, but extremely problematic when it comes to his position on women, okay, as a misogynist, as a pedophile, and a polygamist. But lastly, it's even more problematic, not more problematic, but I should say equally interesting and problematic, the way that he spoke and talked about other Black contemporaries. One of the things that Ig points out in his book correctly is that Muhammad Ali was known to use the language of white supremacy whenever he was speaking about his fellow Black athletes, okay? So typically when he would go into a fight, he was known for being the talker and coming up with all these things he would say. When he was fighting a Black fighter, he would refer to them as an animal. Okay, most notably, the most sort of infamous example of this is when he calls Joe Frazier a gorilla. I'm going to fight the gorilla in Manila. But he would always say, oh, they're ugly, they're not smart, they're not pretty, they're not smart like me, they can't talk. So again, using the language of white supremacy and the perception of Black men as one being unattractive, being ignorant, looking like animals, and putting that on his other Black contemporaries. Yet he didn't do the same thing when he would speak of white contemporaries. Now, to be fair, Ali didn't face as many white opponents because there wasn't a lot of really talented white boxers at this time. But when he did, he spoke about them differently. He didn't talk about their looks. So he said, oh, you're pretty, but you're not as pretty as me. So he didn't talk about, or, oh, well, I know you're a smart fighter, but I'm going to still outthink you. So he would always give them credit in the same way that white supremacy, based off those stereotypes that if you're white, well, you're better looking, you're more intelligent, blah, blah, blah. And that was the language that Ali used. And Frazier eventually had enough of Ali. And if people who know that story know that what Ali did to Frazier was not only unfounded, but it ended up having a very negative impact on Frazier's life, because Ali was such an iconic figure and he was so popular within the Black community, regardless of all the things that I just talked about, that Black people latched onto Ali and then started to dismiss Frazier and call him an Uncle Tom, because Ali's like, oh, Frazier, he's the white man's champion. Oh, Frazier, he's just a gorilla. He's not the real champ. Blah, 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 blah. He's an Uncle Tom. And he actually referred to Frazier as an Uncle Tom, which is ironic because in his own autobiography, Ali admits the reason he sought out Frazier prior to his exile, during his exile, was because he thought Frazier, and confirmed Frazier was a modern Black man who wasn't an Uncle Tom, okay? So that was actually Ali saying it then, but his story changes when it comes to fighting Frazier. Now, some people say, oh, it's just antics, it's just a stage show, he wasn't really meaning it, but it still had effects on Frazier's life, and it still impacted him dramatically, that he spoke about Frazier that way and used that type of language about him, which was again, completely hypocritical in relationship to his sort of stance on the civil rights era as a whole. So, all in all, just a very troubling figure, extremely enigmatic, extremely inconsistent. Yeah, he was a great fighter. Do I think he had the greatest career of all time? No. Like I said, I think he had probably the best career during the greatest era of heavyweight boxing. But I think, toe-to-toe, Joe Frazier in his prime was probably better than Ali. We know that Frazier had eye problems, so we don't know how soon those eye problems became as bad as they end up being by the time we get to the third fight. Their fights were closely matched, but more importantly, I just think Joe Frazier was a better human. And maybe I'll do a whole video on Joe Frazier, because there's a lot I could say about him, and why I think he's a better person to celebrate, and why I'm a Joe Frazier fan versus a Muhammad Ali fan. But hopefully you found that interesting. It just goes to show that the people who oftentimes get sort of put on a pedestal are sometimes often the most problematic. And unfortunately, a lot of this stuff gets lost in history. But if you want to know more about it, read Jonathan Eag's book. It's just called Ali. And it came out in 2017. I've read many books on boxing, many on Ali. That's one of my favorites because I do feel like it gives the fairest account of Ali's life. It does highlight many of the things he did from a talented standpoint as a boxer, but it also is not shy about addressing many of the serious personal and social issues that he did promote and support throughout his lifetime. So, hope you have a great day.